Good morning, I'm Dr. Alonso and welcome to Tiniciti School. Today I'm going to teach about something that is extremely exciting and extremely wonderful. It has to do with strategies to be able to motivate your child into be a better learner. What parent does not want their children to be able to score high in their test, to be able to achieve the goals set out by the school, by the teachers, by the professors? So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about ways that you can educate your child, ways that you can teach them so that that homework that you spend hours the day before in the home after work, after coming home from a long day at work, that you spend time with your child, for that to bear fruit. Because a lot of times one of the things that I hear is that I'm able to do all this with my children, but once they go to school and they take the test, they don't pass. I did all this, I did all that, but they're still struggling academically. So from a scholastic perspective, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about ways that you can foster a better way for your child to learn. Let's start with very basic examples from us adults. How many of you remember where you were back on September 11th, those of you that recall? If you go back into your mind and you think, you're going to probably remember exactly where you were, whether you were at work, in the office, at home, exactly what you were doing before you heard the news of what happened September 11th. Imagine that we would be able to record and memorize information as well as some events in our lives that have stayed with us through eternity. Things that happened to us even as early as 4 or 5 years old, that even today, 20, 30, 40 years later, you're able to recall very precisely. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why we are able to record information and stay with us forever, something we learn that stays with us for life, versus something that is part of a short-term memory or something that eventually just doesn't stay with us long ago. So let's go back to the very basics. We have 5 senses. We have auditory, which is where we hear. We have visual, everything we see. We have olfactory, how we smell. We have gustatory, everything we taste. And we have tactile, anything that we touch. These senses are there for the process of learning, but those senses connect to a part of the brain, specific areas of the brain that allows us to be able to memorize. So there's a difference when you're able to recall the name of, let's say, a fruit and know exactly what it looks like, what it smells like, the texture of it, versus just having an idea of what the fruit may look like. You're not so sure about the name. You don't even know exactly what it tastes like or even what it smells like, but somehow you know that there's such a certain fruit. There's a reason for that. There's a reason because the way that we acquire and recall information, whether it's short-term or long-term, has a lot to do with it. So let's get started. One of the things that, and eventually I'll listen to some questions from the parents and I'll be able to give you more specific and more individualized examples. But one of the things that I always tell parents is fostering visualization for the purpose of schooling, for the purpose of targeting information that you need to recall. There's a part of the brain called the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is right in the back of the point of our head, and it is the information that the brain captures by seeing. So everything that you see goes into the occipital lobe. And what it does is it allows any information that you're able to see in the world, anything, it processes through our eyes and it goes directly to the occipital lobe. I'll get into that one a little bit later. What about fostering information having to do with the way something feels? Well, there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is a very small, the size of almost as a cashew nut in the middle of our brain, and that's where all our emotions are. There's a very important reason why the amygdala plays a vital and important role in education, because anything that you learn, any information that you learn that has an emotion, it tends to record itself better than something that is emotionless, for lack of a better word. So if you recall, for you parents, that anything that you've ever experienced that had a lot of emotions, the birth of your son or your daughter, the wedding, beautiful events or not so beautiful events, they stay with us and we recall them in details for a reason. It has to do a lot with the amygdala. Basically, amygdala is responsible for memories. The next one that I want to focus is the frontal lobe, and this one part in the front of our mind. The frontal lobe is used for problem solving. It's used for planning, thinking, intelligence, attention. And if we don't use that frontal lobe in the process of learning, we don't learn at all. So I'll get into that better. There's also the temporal lobes, the side of the brain. And the side of the brain is responsible basically for anything having to do with visual, at the same time a little bit of, let's say, auditory, a little bit of let's say tactile. It puts everything together. You have right side of the brain, left side of the brain. One is logical, one is illogical. And the last one is the parietal lobes, which is also part of the brain. And that one is mostly for the purpose of shapes and colors and smell. So let's go a little bit about, a lot of time parents tells me my child has a hard time learning, specifically learning new words or how to read. Obviously, we use our eyes in order to read. One of the things that is important in order to foster better learning for the processing of visual, for the processing of reading, is that you just not only read to your child, for your child to also be able to visualize the letters, even if they're not able to read yet. I know a lot of times parents sit with their kids during bedtime and will read a story, and the child listens to a story. Well, you're only dealing with one aspect of the senses, which is the auditory. So when it comes to reading, you have to be able to show your child not just exactly the words that you're reading, not just the pronunciation and the articulation of the words themselves, but you also have to give them a sense of meaning, a sense of emotions, a sense of color, a sense of picture to whatever it is you're reading. A lot of times, because we're older and we read something, we think automatically that the child or whoever hears the story will be able to conceptualize the story just the same we do. Well, we forgot that we've been in this planet for many years and that we've been able to learn to conceptualize things different. Whereas with children, you have to be a little bit more detailed. In fact, you have to be a lot more detailed, because a lot of times what for us is simple, what for us is basic, for them is brand new. For them, it's the very first time they're listening. So one of the best ways for your child to be able to capture something that they're reading is not only for you to read to them, it's not only for them to look at the words, but it's also for them to be able to see shapes of whatever it is that you're showing. That's why a lot of books for children from the ages of, let's say, 0 all the way to 5 or 6 has a lot of pictures. The idea behind, or the concept behind it, is that not only you get to read, but you also get to look at the pictures and sort of bring them together. What if the child is experiencing difficulty in mathematics, which is, by the way, the number one class, the number one academic subject that most children have difficulty with? There's a reason for that. The part of the brains that is responsible for numbers, for mathematics, for anything having to do with formulas, anything having to do with addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, all of that is in the part of the brain that requires a lot more work. It uses the occipital, it uses the parietal lobes, it uses the frontal lobes. So now you're dealing with more areas of the brain. So what are some of the things that we tend to advise parents to do in that case? Number one, just telling them that 2 + 2 is 4 is not sufficient. Just telling them to do a stick, 2 sticks, and 2 sticks, you add those, and that's 4 sticks, it's not sufficient. You have to create a story. A lot of times you need to be very detailed and very creative. Perhaps you need to go into something that the child can identify with. So for instance, you have 2 cats. One is Mimi, the other one is Lucy. What happens if we get 2 more cats? And now one is Josephine and the other one is Christy. We have now 4 cats. Let the child get an idea what it's like to have 2 kitties, what it would be like to have a third and a fourth. So now the child is able to put together not just a number, but also a visual picture of what they're seeing and an emotional component having to do with the fact that they love kitties. Another thing that is important to do is for the child to have an idea, a consensus of what these numbers look like. Well, you think that by just showing them to them in a blackboard or in a computer or even writing them on a piece of paper should be sufficient. No. You have some children that are very tactile. They're very kinesthetic. They need to feel. Some children are perhaps more prone to understand something, not just by seeing them or hearing them and feeling them, but also by touching. So sometimes you actually have to get numbers, whether it be made out of wood or plastic, and have them look at the numbers and play with the numbers. Sometimes they have to see the curve of number 2 and the bar. Sometimes it's not just as simple as saying number 1 is a stick, because it looks very similar to a lowercase l. So they get those confused. A lot of times parents don't understand this, but even though children under the age of 5 are rarely diagnosed with a learning disorder, a specific learning disorder, or with any type of disorder whatsoever, if there's going to be something, it's already there. So let's just say, as hypothetical, that there's dyslexia that is going to take place. Dyslexia is simply that sometimes the numbers get inverse, the letters get inverse. So instead of you listening to a number, they tell you it's 446, the child may write 644 or 646 or something similar. So whenever you're dealing with issues that may come up later that you are not aware of them yet, and God willing they're not, but let's say that there's a possibility, it is extremely important for you to use even more parts of the brain. So a lot of times parents have a hard time understanding, and I'll give you an example. One of the most common questions that I get is, how come my 6-year-old was able to do it, but now my 4-year-old is having difficulty? Guys, parents, please never compare. Every child has a different developmental process. Even though they're 50% mom's genes and 50% dad's genes, that means that the child has DNA from mom and dad, and they have basically both of you guys. Each child is a unique individual, and their process of learning, absorbing, and retaining is very different. So don't ever compare, because one thing that I have seen is when there's a child that is slightly delayed in comparison to a sibling, but then it's only a matter of time before they become head-to-head or even supersede the other child. So let's go back to using space as visual stimulus. Make use of educational props. A lot of times, a lot of parents tell me, what are some of the stuff that I can use? Guys, magazines. We can use different things that you can touch. You can use props. You can use anything that the child is able to have an idea of what it looks like. A lot of times parents use technology, whether it be an iPad, an iPhone, a laptop, a computer, and that's okay, but that's not sufficient. It's basically the same as perhaps that child going to a classroom and learning just based on what the teacher wrote in the smart board or the old blackboard. You need to be able to use other aspects that they are going to be able to learn. And I'll give you an example. Using videos, using television programs. A lot of time, I had a child not too long ago that was having difficulty memorizing the capitals of the states of the United States of America. However, she knew that the capital of Florida was Tallahassee because she had been to Tallahassee with her older brother who had gone to an interview at one of the universities up north. And she had an idea what it looks like. And then after that, on their way down, they went to Disney World. So this child had an idea, a feeling of what Tallahassee was. She had been to Tallahassee. She had visual images of what Tallahassee looked like. I think they visited the mansion of the governor. Then, of course, her brother going and interviewing at the university and so forth. There's no doubt in my mind that Tallahassee was not one of the correct answers. In fact, it most likely was one of the correct answers I meant to say. But what about the capital of, let's say, Georgia, Atlanta? What about the capital of Washington? In other words, what happens when they're not able to connect the dots? Use videos. Use information so they can see a story behind that capital. How was it that they came up with that capital? Let's say Tallahassee. Where did the name Tallahassee come from? How was it that they even decided that Tallahassee was going to go up there in North Florida? What does the word look like? It's a pretty big word. Why is it that the word has a background that has a lot to do with the heritage of this state? And where is it that happened? How come? So it's a matter of not just you telling the child the capital of Florida is Tallahassee. No, it's almost, in a perfect world, they would visit Tallahassee, they would walk around the Capitol, they would get an idea what it's like, how it came to be. But I know that's not always an option. That's not always, it may be a luxury for a lot of students. But one thing I've learned is that whenever the child has an emotional experience, a positive one nonetheless, that is congruent with whatever it is that they're starting to learn about, it brings it alive. It makes it more genuine, more natural. So think about also that if you're studying, let's say you're studying about the ocean, take them to the beach. Take them to a facility that there is things that they can learn about the ocean, about the whales, about the dolphins, about anything having to do with the ocean. Have them smell the ocean, the salt that emanates from the water. Have them sort of have an idea that every ocean, although it has a different name, why it happened. Find out, or help the child find out, what are the most usual beaches that are close to your home, so that they can begin to put things together. Let's say here in South Florida, one of the most famous beaches that we have here is Miami Beach. Well, go to Miami Beach, walk around the sand, touch the water, get them to experience not just the way it looks, the way it's obviously sounds with the sound of the waves, the smell of the ocean, the salt, the fresh air. Have them touch the sand, have them touch the water, realize that it's cold to their feet, but then eventually it becomes warm. Have fun doing this. Enjoy the process. That way their imagination comes together with the reality, and all of a sudden they will never forget what the word orange or ocean means. I had a child that would always confuse orange with ocean. They're not that similar, but when you have a child with dyslexia, it makes a difference. Let's talk about, let's say, I had a child that lives in the state of Kansas, and she wanted to find out a little bit more about what it's like to study the heritage of the state of Kansas. Well, I had this child, the parents went to the museum, the National Museum, and in the museum, even though a lot of it is things that happened in the past, it gave this child a little bit more of an understanding, a feeling of the state that she lived in. Who were the ancestors that lived there? How was it that that state came to be? What is the state bird? What is the state anthem? What are the state colors? Why did they choose those colors? So it's not about just saying Kansas, a state, part of the states, part of the United States of America. No, you have to have an idea, a background, a feeling about why it is that the state, it's named after such name, and why it came to be. If the child has never seen something, it's very difficult, as well as for any adult at the same, to really grasp the concept. We cannot just work on imagination. We cannot just work on throwing the word out there and the child capturing it. So one of the things that I also do, again, going for reading, which is one of the biggest issues that I find in my practice, create a word wall. A nice wall or a vision board of some sort, and big enough and large enough for parents to be able to put words. It makes a difference when the child sees the word repeatedly. Every morning when they get up and they go to get ready to go to school, there's that word that they've been learning for the week. You usually, most of the time, they have an average of about 10 words they have to learn every week before they get a spelling test. I would like for them to see that word on a daily basis. I usually also write next to the word a little bit about the story of the word, a little bit about what the word means, and anything that has to do with that word in their life. So if, let's say, the word is, I had a kid the other day with the word monkey. Well, she now wants to get a monkey. And the mother wrote, put a picture of a monkey, and then she wrote, what are some of the things that monkey eat, and what are some of the monkey places, such as, let's say, zoos or monkey jungles that they can go. All of a sudden, that word has a meaning. She sees the monkey. She's been to the zoo. She knows what the monkey looks like. She's actually had the opportunity to pet a monkey. She made reference in the session of how bad that monkey smelled. That child will not forget the word monkey. So a lot of times I tell them, just don't expect your child to just grasp the word and that's the end of that. No, give them a visual meaning as to what that word actually means to them. Moving forward, be artistic. I always tell parents to think outside the box. Whenever possible, try to express concepts in a visual manner, but also use graphics, organizers, mind mapping. What is mind mapping? A word comes to mind and you brainstorm and think what other words are associated to that. So going back to, let's say, the word apple, and then you put nutritious, and then you put red, and then you put green, and then you put apple pie, and then you put I love it, it tastes delicious. All of a sudden, that child is able to conceptualize not just what the apple word looks like, but also what the apple is, what the apple tastes, the colors of the apple, the texture of the apple. And in an ideal, perfect world, they would have not just the word apple, but an apple next to it, so that they can not just know the word, not just know the spelling, but also part of the brainstorm, how many letters is there in apple? How many apples, different types of variety of apples exist? There's something called a brain-friendly flowchart that I usually put together, and that is where you ask the child to give you every possible word that comes to mind associated with that word. And a lot of times you'll be surprised how creative they are, and somehow everybody's a different world. They have a very unique, each child has a very unique style of how they learn, how they memorize such word. So a lot of the things that I do with this brain mapping is that I let them be creative and come up with things that are related to apple that perhaps for us it makes no sense, but guess what? It does for them. That's sufficient. If they can imagine it, if they can visualize it, if they can sort of have an idea of what it smells like, they will, because of the part of the brain connected to the amygdala, the frontal, the parietal, the occipital. All of a sudden, they don't forget the word. They know how to spell it. They know what it looks like. They're able to give you a complete report on apple. Try teaching in a different location. Goodness, a lot of times parents tells me, we spent hours yesterday in the dining room preparing for the exam, and then she did not do as well. Hold on. I mentioned earlier that a lot of times there are some undeveloped issues, unactivated situations that will take place in the child's life. So I'll give you an example. A lot of times children have difficulty focusing and paying attention. Not because they're going to have issues with attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity. No, maybe yes, maybe not. But simply because they're having a hard time focusing and retaining. Changing environments, going from the dining room to the living room, from the living room to the porch to the patio, or even to a library. It changes everything. Sometimes the color of the walls, sometimes that sound of someone working on the yard next door takes away their ability to focus and retain information. They are so inattentive that any external stimuli makes it difficult for them to be able to focus. So try teaching in a different location. Do you always stand in front of your child? Do you sit next to your child? Do you sit across from your child? You need to be creative. If you stand in front of the child, now you're playing the same role of a teacher. Maybe they have a hard time with that. Maybe they spend the last 8 hours in class and they don't want someone standing in front of them. Sit next to them. Sometimes not necessarily to the right or to the left, but even in a little corner, so that at least you're there supervising. Move about a bit. If you stand still, if you're teaching your child something and you're there, remember, attention span is short, no more than 2 minutes. So you have to be creative. You may have to move around and get a prop and show this and tell a story and sit back down and get back up. It sounds like a lot of work, but I'll tell you, number one, it makes homework funner, easier, more interesting and exciting. They may actually look forward to spending time with you guys and doing homework together, believe it or not. I've had parents that tell me, now we're having fun. They moved the study from the dining room, which, by the way, that's where you're supposed to dine, not do homework. That's why later they don't want to even sit in the dining room again, because they've sat there for 2 hours and now they have to sit there for another hour having dinner. So you have to be creative. Try reorienting yourself so that the material that you're teaching comes from your own place. Be unique. A lot of times we read a book and we say, okay, this is what's going to work, but it's not natural. You're not a teacher, and thank God for that, but guess what? You're a parent, so you have to sort of be creative. So don't just go with what worked for you. A lot of times we have to think outside the box and go for what may work for that child. How do you know? You have to try different options. That's just the bottom line. Go outside to complete worksheets or have your child be able to do something while you're doing something. So I'll give you an example. Some children do better by being active while they're doing something. I'll give you an example. We have a part of so we have the conscious brain that is aware about what's happening right now, and you're trying to focus on one, paying attention. And we also have the subconscious brain, which is taking care of many different things. Everything that is involuntary, heart rate, blinking, respiration, but it also is processing other things. If you're busy, if you're walking in the park or in the sidewalk with your mom or with your dad or with a tutor and talking, that child is probably more apt to capture that information than by just sitting down. Why? Very simple. Because they are engaged in an activity. Thus their focus, number one, from a conscious perspective is on you, but subconscious is walking. Hear me out again. Subconsciously, there's a lot of thoughts taking place in the child's brain, just like in our brain. Subconsciously, there's a lot of emotions taking place just because that's just the way it is. That's another topic for another day. If you make the subconscious busy by getting that child to stand up and walk, not only that child now is focused on walking with you, but listening to you as well. Make a point to being unique and unusual wherever you teach. Don't think that what worked for you is going to work for your child. Don't think that what worked for your son that was younger now is going to work for your daughter who's older, or vice versa. Don't think that what worked for your husband or your wife is going to work for your child. We're all different. So if something doesn't work, don't get frustrated. Stop and change. Sometimes you may need to go through 2 or 3 different styles of teaching or educating before it clicks. Give lots and lots and lots of examples. And by the way, why? Because that's life. A lot of times someone sells us something, we say, give me an example. What does it look like? What color is it? So abstract concept, anything that is abstract, like the notion of paying attention or persistence, are hard to visualize. How do you really show a child something abstract? Even if you say, well, this is how you pay attention. You sit and you look. That's not really paying attention. That's sitting and looking. So you have to be creative, and in some cases, give examples that back up your concept. So I'll give you an example, for instance. You're teaching the child what it's like to be persistent, what it's like to be able to do something and carry it out. You give them stories that work for that you do. I'll make it more simple, actually, because persistent may not be something that is applicable at that age. But let's say you're teaching the child how to be polite. Very simple. We teach our children the process of being polite and respectful and kind. So you use examples where you do almost a role play. Good morning, Mrs. Smith. How are you? Oh, good morning, Mrs. Diaz. Good morning. And you use examples. You also use body language. You smile. You extend your hand. You shake your hand. So a lot of times you have to role model exactly the example that you're trying to convey. And please make it fun. Fun goes to the amygdala. So what was boring or tedious, all of a sudden it's fun. Why? Because you're laughing, you're using jokes, you're getting down to the level. You're actually sitting with them, whether it be in the chair or in the floor. You're not playing the role of a teacher. Leave that to the teacher. Leave that to the experts and the professionals. You're playing the role of a parent trying to teach your child how to be a better learner. One of the most difficult things for parents is to try to make sense why the child is not learning something in particular. If what you've gotten used to is to simply show them one picture or one aspect of the situation, of the story, of the concept, of the idea, that's not sufficient. You have to show them all different angles. And you have to give them examples. And you have to come up with not just the visual component, what it looks like. What are the colors? Is it bright? Is it dim? Is it orange? Is it purple? You also have to have an idea what it sounds like, the pronunciation of the word. Or if you're teaching about a lion, the roar of a lion. Or if you're teaching about something with a melody, the sound of the instrument, or whether it be the guitar, the piano, the violin. You have to make sure that they are able to identify with the idea from an emotional perspective. So if you're teaching them something, give them a backstory. Let's say you're teaching them the word dog, or you're teaching them how to spell dog. Don't just teach them word, picture, 3 letters, D-O-G. Go behind. Tell them a story when you were a little girl or a little boy and you had a dog. What was the name of the dog? What kind of breed was the dog? How old were you when you got the dog? And what were the things you like to do with the dog? So sometimes all of a sudden, it's not so much about the dog, but about mommy or daddy and their pet when they were young. And all of a sudden, now they are able to put things together. If they're able to touch a dog, even better. Not only they see it, not only they hear the dog bark, not only they are able to touch and smell the dog. The more senses you use to be able to have the child from all the different parts of the brain absorb this information, it will be retained. What happens when you experience some issues that you don't understand why it's happening? Sometimes we may need to reach out to a professional for the very basic principle of simply saying, is this normal? Is this okay? A lot of times, all they need to tell you is, yeah, it's appropriate, it's age appropriate. And a lot of times they'll say, well, may not be an issue yet, but it may be an issue in the future, so we can talk about it. But at the very least, it normalizes things for you. At the very least, it gives you an idea. So, point being, if you ever run into an issue or difficulty, don't get frustrated, don't lose hope. The sooner and the earlier that we provide an intervention, the better we'll be. So, with that in mind, I know a couple parents had a couple questions and they are in the presence and available. So I'm going to listen to some of the questions that I know some of the parents have. That way I can, all of a sudden we're teaching our child to be potty trained, to do their homework. We're giving them for the first time responsibilities, make their bed and so forth, tie your shoelaces. The child is always going to want to play because that's what they've known and that's what they've done since they were born. Play, have fun, eat, sleep. Number one, be patient. The child is learning, number one, to stop playing to do something that for them is work. All of a sudden they're going from id, which is pleasure, to ego, which is responsibility. Structure is the number one key here, and consistency. Structure and consistency. So number one, before time, you let the child know you have until 5 to play. That's just an example. 30 minutes before, in 30 minutes, we're going to stop so we can do our homework. 10 minutes before, you just don't wait till the end. Time's up, come, because they need a gradual process of shifting, a process of decompressing from playfulness to seriousness. So once they finish, then you say, okay, we do this. Always have an incentive in mind. By the way, when we're done your homework, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. So to answer your question, it's a process of learning to do what is called behavior modification. It takes a while. Don't be frustrated. Couple it with fun, based on what I just mentioned, the idea of making the homework or the process of teaching fun, and then have them something to look forward to. That being said, it's important to keep in mind, based on the child developmental age, how long you can focus for. Don't expect a child that is 6 years old for you to do homework with them for 3 hours. That's not going to happen. So if the child is very young, you have to probably break it into increments of 20 to 30 minutes. If the child's a little older, 45 to an hour. And that's how they get used to it. You say, okay, we're going to do homework for the next 30 minutes. Then you're going to take a bath. And then we're going to have dinner. And then we'll finish the other 30 minutes. Sometimes it fits for one child. and maybe not for the sibling, and that's okay. But what you don't want is for the child to be stuck doing something for hours because they lose focus. Next question.
My child seems very reserved. His teachers have brought it to my attention, and I'm curious if it's a transitory thing or maybe there's some technique I could use.
I remember getting that question a lot, and especially once from my own dad about one of my own little brothers. And my answer is, give it time. Give it time. Every child develops differently. We're not going to get into the different developmental stages, but it's okay for a child to be an introvert. It's okay for a child to be shy. What may first appear as a very secluded, a very isolated child, little by little, once they get to engage and connect with other children his age or its peers, that should begin to subside. Give it time. Typically, you begin to see the change in the home front, meaning that in front of you, your spouse, your significant other, and maybe the grandma, they're okay, but that behavior is mostly exhibited outside the home. Let's say when you're with neighbors or when you're with other people which are strangers to the child. So that's normal. The child needs a process of adaptation. So if the problem continues past the age of, let's say, and it's evident, and there's been no gradual process, because if there's even a sense of improvement, then keep giving it more time, because an improvement in itself tells me that the child will get there. It's just taking him a little or her a little longer. But if it continues and we're already soon to enter puberty, so let's say 10, 11, 12, and we're still having that, then I would recommend for them to be seen by somebody just for the sake of ruling out anything, or simply for them to tell you, give it time, which is, by the way, what I mostly do. Next question.
So I have 2 young daughters. They are 3 and almost 6. I'm proud to say that they are very independent when it comes to personal duties like hygiene or self-feeding or different chores in the house. But it gets a little bit complicated for me, especially in the mornings when you need to rush to work and to drop them off. I constantly need to ask them to do it. How can I show them that it's important to help mommy?
Excellent question, by the way. Thank you for that question. So I'm always going to go back and remind everyone that children, all they want to do is play and eat and sleep. So what you're basically telling them is that they have to get up early, do a couple of chores, get ready to go to school, which nobody wants. And nobody wants to do that. So what happens? Guys, first and foremost, we need to have structure. It's imperative that children go to bed to a certain time. By the way, something important to keep in mind. While we sleep, not just children and adults, but predominantly children, is that everything that you've learned throughout the day gets archived, gets filed away. While we sleep is that everything gets put away. So everything that you learn throughout the day while you sleep is that it files away. If you don't sleep, you're not going to remember things because they were not filed away. So there's times, particularly in college, students will stay up all night studying, cramming for a test, and then take the test in the morning and they pass. That's called short-term memory. Ask them the same question in the afternoon and it's gone. But if you study and you sleep, it gets archived. Number 2, they've done research from children who are in school versus children that are not in school, and they found that children that are in school require more sleep. Why? There's more information to file away. So please, parents, children must have at least 8 hours of sleep, number 1. Number 2, technology. You cannot play video games because of the way that it stimulates your brain until 8 o'clock and then go to bed at 8:30. No, you need at least 2 hours for the mind to decompress. So if you're allowing your child to play with their iPad or with their video games, and you want them in bed by what time? 10? Video games end at 8. Take a shower, take a bath, watch some TV, read a book. So by the time 10 o'clock comes in, they're already relaxed. So never expect to see a child fall asleep right after finishing a very stimulating, a very exciting, a very emotional video game. Don't. Structure. So if you're having problems, as you just mentioned, with them doing it, keep the structure. And also sometimes we need to set aside what most parents don't like to do, and especially children don't like to receive, which is consequences. So if you don't do this, we will not do this after school today. Let's say that after school they usually get a treat. They stop to get an ice cream, or they stop to get some McDonald's or something like that, which, by the way, I don't recommend. That being said, if we don't do this, we can forget that you'll be able to do your play date with your friend later on. If we don't do this, you can forget that we're not going to do this. What you're basically already teaching them is what we all face in life: actions and reactions. Everything has consequences. But you'll be surprised. It all has a lot to do with the personality of the child. A lot of times they may remind you of you as a child, or of your husband, let's say. And what that tells you is that they're simply being one of you, tiny. So use what worked for you. Maybe the way that your parents did something worked for you. Of course, make it more updated, because the parenting style of back then, it's not appropriate today. But sometimes you'll be surprised that what worked for you may work for your child, because guess what? 50% of your DNA is theirs. Next question, please. No questions. Well, that's good. That means I've done a good job, because everything is so perfect that we don't have any more questions. It's been a pleasure, and we will be doing this on a monthly basis, and I'm looking forward. Feel free to send questions, ideas, topics that may be relevant and that may be able to be answered by doing these webinars. You have yourself a great day. And by the way, one of the things that I'm the proudest about is here at Tiniciti, they have a very customized, very individualized education system, enriched environment, advanced technology, emotional intelligence curriculum. That's what you need. And that was what the presentation was about. Basically, all I said about today, it's already been done here in this school setting. Thus, the children are already learning using all senses, using all parts of the brain. And all I want you to do is to continue the extension of what they're doing here at Tiniciti, but in the home setting. That way, you're keeping one thing in consistency, which is the very same style. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I'm Dr. Alonso.